let's pretend that you're responsible for designing a body-worn connected disposable that is going to be used in a home environment. And this article that you wrote, Will, recently, addressed when you're faced with a complex disposable development challenge, the first thing you should do and where you should focus is the interface. So the interface between the device and the user, the device and embedded electronics, the device in the physical space, and clearly the device and the digital world. Maybe not the metaverse, but the digital world
Not
at
yet.
this point. Yeah, not yet. So, what do you mean when you say consider the interfaces? Why do you say that?
The primary reason that I say that is because in any engineering development project, you want to think about your constraints and identify areas of maximum complexity. And in a lot of cases, in the kinds of devices that we design, the interface between your disposable and your durable elements are that point of maximum complexity. And furthermore, there a lot of times in as these medical technologies get more and more complex, the disposable may even be the most complex element. We're finding more and more that the interfaces are the best place to start because you typically have the maximum number of constraints in those areas, and then you can kind of fill in the blanks from there, right? So if you define your constraints that where or you define your interfaces where you have all of that complexity, and you're going to need to spend probably the largest amount of your design time on improving those and making those robust, because they're going to see a lot of cycling and things like that as well, which are going to add to the constraints that you have on that design. It's best to start there and then fill in what can often be the easier stuff in between.
Speaking of constraints, let's talk about probably the hardest one, the user. What should you consider when you start thinking about the constraint of the user, or the interface rather, with the user and your device?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that for a lot of reasons, that can be the most complex of these interfaces. And in my experience, the reason for that is really because in all of your other interfaces, or at least most of your other kinds of interfaces, you as the designer have a significant degree of control over both sides of your, right? So from durable to disposable, you have control over both sides of that. And on the patient side, you only have control over one side, your device or disposable side of that interface. And you need to account for a very wide variety in many cases of, physiological geometry, or other constraints in designing for that user. And you need to think very deeply about how a user will interact with that interface and ways in which they could potentially misuse it, which are going to be, the most difficult in that space. So I'm sure later we'll talk about a variety of ways that you can make device to disposable connections more intuitive. And a lot of those things are really not on the table for the disposable to patient interface. One example of a product that I've spent a lot of my time on at Keytech, like you alluded to earlier, is the CoolStat thermal regulation device that we developed for Cooltech Medical. And I remember in designing the disposable elements for that, it was relatively early in my time at Keytech, and I kind of overestimated the ability of a user to figure out right away, exactly what I intended with my design. And so I remember one of the founders of Keytech, Brian Lipford, stressing on me that they're going to put this mask on upside down. You might think that it looks obvious. You might think that, but they're certainly going to put it on upside down. And sure enough, we proceeded into a user study partway into that project, and put this mask in front of people, ask them to figure out how to put that on. And sure enough, about 40% of the users put it on upside down. You need to assume that your users are going to do all sorts of wild things to misuse your device. And so you need to make it as intuitive as possible. And so working with our industrial design team, I was able to make some small changes to make that more intuitive, and things that can seem a little too obvious, but for example, in this case, we added just a sticker on mask, that just says this side arrow points towards your eyes. So sometimes it can be that simple.
So, Will, you mentioned making these devices as intuitive as possible so that you don't misuse them. If you need to add labels, great. That'll help prompt the user to take certain action. But in your experience, what are some other ways you can make devices intuitive and easy to use?
So some things that we use are poka-yoking, which is basically putting some kind of a keyed feature on both sides of your interface so that it's not possible to place that in, maybe the incorrect orientation. Or if you have two similar interfaces on your device, you want to make sure that one element will only fit in one of those two similar interfaces. So, let's say you have two circular interfaces, you put a notch on one and two notches on the other, something like that. Another one is color coding or the use of symbols. So it seems easy and obvious, but a lot of times your first instinct is to just design an interface and expect that it's obvious to the user where that thing is going to go. But if you do something simple like make both sides of the interface red, or put a little symbol on both sides, so one on your disposable element, for example, and one on your device side, and the user can kind of easily identify those and just match them up in making that connection, it does an immense amount to really streamline that process and make it more intuitive. The last thing is to take advantage of what people are used to, right? So there's a lot of things in just life in general that people are doing very repetitively all the time. And it makes sense in the design of medical products to think about those things and try and relate your product to those things that people are used to, so that it's more intuitive just based on muscle memory and what they've spent a lot of time doing in their life.
Yeah. So, how did you reflect that in your experience on the cool stat, if you did?
Sure.
There's the mask, you put it on, right? So,
Yep. On the coolsat side, the two big interfaces other than the mask, which goes straight on the face that I'll get to in a minute, are a desiccant cartridge that has some media in it that'll dry the air because that's for delivery of dry, and that has a circular interface where you insert the cartridge directly into the top of the device, and there's a cavity there that's the exact size of your disposable cartridge, and so that's basically one method of poka-yoking, is to create this volume in your device that's very obviously intended for that one element. And then on the tube set side, for the interface between the tube and the device, there's a custom manifold that has a specific rectangular shape with some specific, you could call it poka-yoked features on the edges of that fit directly into the front of the device, where there's a peristaltic pump to drive the delivery of saline, which is necessary for that therapy. And we needed to go through a couple of iterations to get that right based on feedback from user study, to make that interface as obvious as possible and disambiguate that from the desiccant cartridge. And then in terms of things that people are very used to, the saline interface, we use a saline spike that clinical staff, which are the typical operators of this device, are using for many products in their time at the hospital. And so it's something that they're used to. They're going to know where to put that. And so we're taking advantage of what they're used to in that case. And then on the mask side, we did some benchmarking off of existing products that are very common, like CPAPs, and designed a nasal mask that it takes advantage of a lot of kinds of features that people who suffer from sleep apnea are used to. And even if you don't suffer from sleep apnea, chances are you know someone who does, and so you've heard of what a CPAP is, and the mask is more likely to be intuitive to you if you've experienced that.